Picture this. The lights fade out. The score begins to creep beneath the silence. And somewhere between the very first frame and the very last, something fundamental shifts inside you. You are no longer watching the film. The film has turned its gaze on you. That is the true power of the psychological thriller, a genre forged not on creatures or chaos, but on the slow, suffocating awakening that the human mind is the most treacherous place in existence. These are not simply films. They are encounters that reshape your thinking, disturb your nights, and force you to look differently at every person seated across from you at the table. We have journeyed through the entire history of cinema, from the earliest black and white masterworks to the most celebrated modern achievements, and assembled the 15 most shattering, mind-altering, nerve-destroying psychological thrillers ever brought to the screen. Prepare yourself, because once you travel through this list, the world around you will never feel entirely the same. Rear Window, 1954. Before we step into the modern age of cinema, we have to pause right here because Alfred Hitchcock did not simply craft a thriller. He wrote the entire playbook that every director since has spent their career attempting to rewrite. James Stewart portrays L.B. Jeffries, a photographer confined to his apartment with a fractured leg, with nothing to occupy himself but gazing out his window at the neighbors filling the courtyard opposite. Seems harmless at first. Mildly intrusive, perhaps. But then one evening something changes. A woman has vanished. Her husband's behavior turns suspicious. And Jeffries, immobilized and powerless, grows certain he has witnessed a murder that nobody around him will accept as real. What makes Rear Window so relentlessly suffocating is not the mystery at its heart. It is the helplessness. You are observing a man who can only observe, incapable of acting, incapable of proving anything, incapable of halting whatever might be approaching. Every window across that courtyard holds a miniature story, a miniature existence, and the dread comes from understanding that any one of those existences might be sheltering something truly monstrous. Hitchcock transforms the simple act of watching into something dangerous and morally loaded. By the time the reality of the situation crashes violently through that apartment door, your pulse is hammering and your fingers are locked around the armrest. Rear Window is not merely a timeless classic. It is the very reason the psychological thriller was born. Vertigo, 1958. Hitchcock once more, and this time he is not merely unsettling you. He is dismantling your entire capacity to trust your own eyes. James Stewart returns as Scotty Ferguson, a detective crippled by a terror of heights who is hired to shadow an enigmatic woman named Madeline. He falls for her. Completely, recklessly, beyond all reason. And then everything collapses beneath him. Vertigo functions on a register of psychological devastation that feels almost intimate in its cruelty. Hitchcock deploys spiral imagery, rich color, and Bernard Herrmann's intoxicating score to draw you so deeply into Scotty's obsession that you begin to experience it as your own. By the moment the film surrenders its secrets, you are not merely watching a man surrender his hold on reality. You are surrendering yours right alongside him. Very few films in the history of cinema have mapped the madness of obsessive love with such precision or such anguish. Vertigo was rejected and misread upon its release. Today, it is consistently named the greatest film humanity has ever produced. Every syllable of that distinction is deserved. Psycho, 1960. Every list of this kind places this film at the summit. We are placing it here instead. Because Psycho did not merely transform the psychological thriller, it detonated an explosive charge at the very foundation of cinema and compelled everyone to construct something new from what remained. Marion Crane takes stolen money and registers at the Bates Motel, and what follows is 45 minutes of mounting, creeping horror before Hitchcock commits an act so savage and so unimaginable that the audiences of 1960 had no framework to absorb it. He destroys his leading character. In the shower. In the middle of the story. After that moment, nothing in cinema was protected. No character, no narrative expectation, no established rule. Norman Bates, brought to life by Anthony Perkins with an aching, deeply unsettling precision, became the original blueprint for every cinematic psychopath that came after him. But what elevates Psycho above everything that has imitated it is the depth of feeling Hitchcock generates for these shattered human beings. Marion fleeing from her own poor judgment, Norman imprisoned by his. The true horror here is not the blade. It is the isolation. It is the portrait of how ordinary, quiet sadness can ferment into something catastrophic when it is left to fester long enough. Psycho is 7 decades old and remains completely, devastatingly effective. Rosemary's Baby, 1968. Roman Polanski seized the most tender and vulnerable experience available to a woman, carrying a child, and transformed it into a nightmare that advances in slow, inevitable increments. Mia Farrow's Rosemary relocates to a Manhattan apartment building with her driven, ambitious husband, and what opens as a hopeful new beginning curdles rapidly into a waking terror she cannot identify or prove to anyone. Everyone surrounding her appears to possess knowledge she has been denied. Her husband, her neighbors, her physicians, each of them offering warm smiles, each of them extending help, each of them concealing something beneath the surface. Polanski constructs his trap with patience and precision, deploying the ordinary textures of domestic existence to manufacture a mounting, suffocating certainty that something has gone profoundly and irreversibly wrong. The true terror of Rosemary's Baby is the terror of being dismissed, of crying out in a room filled with people who respond only with gentle, knowing smiles. Farrow's portrayal is so exposed and undefended that watching it becomes almost painful. By the time the full truth arrives, the horror registers not as surprise but as grim inevitability, as though this nightmare had only ever been heading in one direction. This film did not simply reshape the horror genre. It permanently redrew the boundaries of what cinema was permitted to inflict upon its audience. The Silence of the Lambs, 1991. There are screen villains, and then there is Hannibal Lecter. Anthony Hopkins occupied barely 16 minutes of total screen time in this production, and collected the Academy Award for Best Actor. That single fact communicates everything necessary. Jonathan Demme's extraordinary film follows Clarice Starling, a young FBI trainee portrayed by Jodie Foster with contained, steely courage and barely suppressed dread, as she descends into a maximum security institution to conduct interviews with a brilliant, incarcerated cannibal in pursuit of an active serial killer. What develops between them is one of the most electrically charged psychological confrontations in the entire history of cinema. Lecter does not simply respond to questions. He dissects the person asking them. He perceives dimensions of Clarice that she has never allowed herself to examine. Every exchange with him is a landscape seeded with manipulation, razor-sharp intelligence, and authentic threat. The film generates its terror not through carnage or sudden shocks, but through the unbearable closeness of those encounters separated by reinforced glass. Two human beings engaged in conversation. And somehow, it is the most terrifying sequence you have ever witnessed. Say 7N 1995. David Fincher took possession of the detective thriller and hauled it into territory so morally desolate and spiritually dark that the genre emerged permanently altered on the other side. Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman portray mismatched investigators pursuing a killer who is choreographing murders in homage to the 7 deadly sins. What initially presents itself as a conventional crime narrative transforms into a masterclass in relentless, grinding dread, as the perpetrator, a skeletal, philosophically sophisticated predator portrayed by Kevin Spacey, appears to operate perpetually beyond their reach. The city itself functions as a participant in the story, drenched in unending rain and quietly decomposing, as though the world has already accepted its own defeat. But it is the conclusion that permanently scorches Say 7N into your consciousness. The final 20 minutes constitute one of the most viscerally devastating and morally annihilating sequences ever assembled in Hollywood. Fincher does not hesitate. He does not cushion the impact. He places the horror directly in your hands and withdraws. What is contained in the box? By the time the answer arrives, you will almost regret having asked the question. Gone Girl, 2014. David Fincher once more. Because when the subject is cinema that makes you fundamentally distrust everyone you have ever loved, no filmmaker alive approaches his command of the material. Ben Affleck portrays Nick Dunn, a man whose wife Amy disappears on the morning of their 5th wedding anniversary. The media machinery activates. Nick projects guilt from every angle. But then Amy herself begins to speak. Through flashback, through voiceover narration, through diary passages saturated with her own carefully constructed account of events. Gone Girl is a film about marriage reconceived as psychological combat, about the curated performances we maintain for public consumption versus the actual selves we inhabit in private. Rosamund Pike constructs a portrayal of such cold, immaculate calculation that it generates a physical sensation of unease in the most rewarding way imaginable. As the film peels back its successive layers, certainty dissolves entirely. You cannot identify who merits belief, who merits sympathy, or whether any figure in this story has earned the right to escape what is coming. It is savage, laced with dark humor, and absolutely pitiless in its examination of the deceptions embedded at the core of every intimate relationship. Old Boy 2003. Park Chan-wook produced a film of such unrelenting brutality and emotional devastation that when it claimed the grand prize at Cannes, jury president Quentin Tarantino reportedly engaged in fierce debate to secure the honor for it. A man is confined without explanation in a private cell for 15 years. He is then set free, equipped with money and a mobile phone, and presented with a challenge. Discover the identity of the person who imprisoned him and understand why. What unfolds is a fever dream of vengeance, consuming obsession, and a concluding revelation so catastrophically destructive that audiences have reported genuine physical illness in response to it. Old Boy functions at a register that the overwhelming majority of films never approach. It is simultaneously operatic and repulsive and searingly, heartbreakingly human. The hallway confrontation, a solitary man facing an entire corridor of opponents, captured in a single continuous take, stands among the most extraordinary action sequences ever committed to film. But the violence is not the substance of the work. The truth is the instrument of destruction. And the truth that Old Boy delivers is something that will remain with you permanently, whether you want it to or not. Black Swan 2010. Darren Aronofsky transformed the rarefied universe of professional ballet into a psychological pressure chamber so intense that it allows you to experience the fracture of a human mind developing in real time before your eyes. Natalie Portman inhabits Nina, a perfectionist dancer selected for the dual role of the Swan Queen in a production of Swan Lake, a casting that demands both the immaculate, restrained white swan and the untamed, dangerous black swan. Nina has mastered perfection. She possesses no understanding whatsoever of how to be dangerous. What originates as professional ambition and the pressure of artistic achievement progresses into total psychological disintegration, as Nina loses the capacity to distinguish herself from the character she is performing, reality from hallucination, creative dedication from self-destruction. Portman's commitment to the role is absolute on every level, physical and emotional. She shed significant weight, underwent intensive dance training, and simultaneously delivered one of the most terrifying interior performances that modern cinema has produced. Black Swan confronts you with a single, unanswerable question. What are you genuinely prepared to obliterate in the pursuit of absolute perfection? Whatever your answer, it will follow you long after the credits have finished. Shutter Island 2010. Martin Scorsese crafted a film of such labyrinthine complexity and such total commitment to its own spiraling internal logic that a significant portion of its audience required multiple viewings to comprehend what they had witnessed, and then pursued a third viewing simply because the experience demanded it. Leonardo DiCaprio portrays a United States Marshal who arrives at an isolated psychiatric institution during a violent storm to investigate the disappearance of a patient. From the opening frame, something registers as fundamentally wrong. The facility's staff exhibit an unnatural composure. The patients demonstrate an unsettling familiarity. The island itself feels like a mechanism that is slowly tightening around its visitor with each passing hour. Scorsese saturates every scene with dread and sumptuous, nightmarish visual construction. But the true brilliance of Shutter Island resides in the way it weaponizes your own assumptions. You are perpetually one step behind the narrative, perpetually assembling the incorrect theory, perpetually placing your confidence in the wrong individual. The ending does not merely recontextualize everything you have observed. It dismantles everything you believed you understood about the film itself, and about its devastated, achingly tragic central figure. Memento 2000. Christopher Nolan fractured the architecture of cinematic storytelling with this singular achievement. Guy Pearce portrays Leonard, a man rendered incapable of forming new memories following a traumatic assault that also claimed the life of his wife. He pursues the identity of her killer through a personal system of Polaroid photographs and tattoos inscribed across his own body. The narrative moves in reverse chronological order. You inhabit Leonard's fragmented perception of reality as he himself inhabits it, stripped of context, stripped of certainty, perpetually reassembling a past that continues to shift and dissolve beneath your feet. Memento stands as one of the most formally courageous films ever constructed, yet it justifies every element of its structural daring because beneath the architecture lies a profoundly sorrowful exploration of grief, willful self-deception, and the private narratives we fabricate in order to continue existing. By the concluding scene, which is technically the opening scene, what you experience is not merely admiration for the craft on display. It resembles something far closer to mourning. Nolan has never again produced anything approaching this degree of intimacy. A Beautiful Mind, 2001. Ron Howard took the documented life of mathematical visionary John Nash and shaped it into one of the most emotionally exact and humanely rendered explorations of mental illness that the cinema has ever offered. Russell Crowe embodies Nash, a Princeton prodigy drawn into covert government cryptography work, constructing a life populated by brilliant colleagues, a devoted and loving wife, and intellectual labor that appears to constitute his entire reason for existing. Then the film reveals what it has been concealing. And every scene you have absorbed, every relationship you have witnessed develop, every moment of triumph you have shared in, demands to be processed again through an entirely different understanding. A Beautiful Mind does not weaponize its subject's illness for shock value or dramatic exploitation. It employs it to pose a question that is quieter and far more devastating. What path remains open to you when your own mind has become an unreliable narrator of your existence? When the very faculty that elevates you above ordinary experience is simultaneously the force dismantling everything you have constructed. Crowe's portrayal is vast in its ambition yet never descends into display. And the film's emotional integrity earns without manipulation every emotional response it draws from its audience. The Game, 1997. Fincher once more. Because this director appears constitutionally incapable of producing work that does not permanently rearrange something within the viewer's mind. Michael Douglas portrays Nicholas Van Orton, a remote and wealthy investment banker whose younger brother presents him with an unconventional birthday offering. Admission into a private organization that designs and delivers a bespoke, fully immersive real-world game experience. It registers initially as in curiosity. Then it begins extracting payment. His composure, his finances, his physical safety, his grip on what is real. The game places you in precisely the same psychological position as its central character. You genuinely cannot distinguish what is authentic, what has been orchestrated, and what has simply exceeded all reasonable boundaries. Each time you construct what feels like stable footing, Fincher removes it without warning. The paranoia becomes all-consuming. The tension does not release for a single moment. And the resolution, contingent upon your personal threshold for a particular variety of cinematic boldness, will register as either a devastating blow or a profound cathartic release. Regardless of your response, the film will occupy your thoughts long after it has ended. Prisoners, 2013. Denis Villeneuve constructed a film centered on the single most devastating fear that any parent carries, the disappearance of a child, and then made the deliberate, unflinching choice not to allow it to resolve into a straightforward narrative of righteousness and wickedness. Hugh Jackman portrays Keller Dover, a father whose young daughter vanishes during a Thanksgiving gathering. Jake Gyllenhaal portrays the investigator assigned to the case, whose pace may or may not be sufficient. And Paul Dano portrays the individual Dover has become absolutely certain is responsible, in the complete absence of any admissible evidence. What Prisoners accomplishes that virtually no other thriller has the courage to attempt is to hold its audience inside a sustained state of moral anguish for nearly 2.5 hours without ever extending the comfort of resolution. The actions Dover takes in the name of protecting what he loves are genuinely terrible. Terrible in ways that, experienced within the logic of the film, feel disturbingly close to comprehensible. Villeneuve withholds judgment. He withholds consolation. He withholds the clean conclusion. The final image of this film is among the most quietly annihilating visual statements in contemporary cinema, and it will occupy your consciousness for days after the experience has ended.